Scramble by I Had Him on the Ropes, Carter Reed, and Rory Gone Maddie, roasted 10 days. Chapter 7, Day 528. The fallout from the Clark-Lois breakup poisoned everything. Bruce, in all honesty, wasn't even aware of the couple separating until Lois Lane poured a glass of 1995 Krug Clois Diambonnet over him, which, frankly, he was surprised she'd even managed to get any of, given the $4,000 price tag, and the bartender with a seriously terminal case of looking down his nose at anyone without 18-karat diamond rings and a string of pearls around their neck. She'd been covering the latest Wayne Enterprises gala, a charity auction where Brucey's rich friends all bought things they didn't need for prices they didn't even blink at despite the volume of zeros. Also, they could say they saved Gotham's orphanages and helped build a homeless shelter. Brucey had already had a few too many, polishing off a bottle of champagne all on his own, although the large ficus in the corner drank more than he did. Brucey would feel a little guilty about watering houseplants with alcohol if his cover wasn't so ridiculously reliant on him looking raging drunk every other day. When he stumbled into the side of a red dress filled with Lois Lane, she turned, annoyed, before her face took on an expression Bruce had seen only a handful of times before, and they all usually ended in him getting shot, stabbed, or in Ivy's case, a face full of sex, murder, lust, dust. Lois had been no exception. Eyes wide and flaming, she nearly snarled before shoving him back and upturning her glass in one smooth movement. The action left him dripping wet, sticky, and once the champagne seeped through his clothes and into the open cuts on his back from some axe-wielding maniacs belonging to the Joker, in horrible stinging pain. She'd shoved him again, keeping her palm raised, clearly torn between slapping him or just walking away. Luckily for Bruce's cheeks, the moral high ground won out and she stormed off, hair whipping him in the face as she left. The billionaire made sure to catch someone's eye, smirk a little too leerily for the look to be comfortable, while rolling his eyes and exclaiming in his airiest voice, "Women." The press ate it up. After all, while it wasn't the first time he'd showered in someone's drink, Lois was a bit different from the usual heiresses who performed such dramas. By the time Bruce had made his escape, peeling the suit off his limbs in disgust, leaving it crumpled in one horrible sticky pile for Alfred to deal with, and dragged Kevlar on in its place, he was trending on Twitter, and a newspaper headline, "Wayne Gets Wet," complete with pictures and, much to his horror, video, had garnered several hundred comments already. All in all, the world relished in Brucey getting a taste of his own medicine, but ultimately saw nothing past the event other than Lois was a jilted lover finally regaining her power. Bruce, of course, knew differently. It was several hours, nearing the end of his patrol, that had luckily let him kick some people in the face enough that he'd burnt off the annoyance at Lane, that his visitor appeared, traditionally wrapped in red, white, and blue. It was a flutter of red, a soft sigh, and then in a small voice, "I broke up with Lois." Bruce sighed quietly, but didn't turn. He knew we should tell Clark that this was still his city, and heartbreak or not, the Kryptonian wasn't exactly welcome in Gotham, but a single glance at the sorry sight that was the most powerful person on Earth, and he realized that it wasn't worth it. Not tonight, at least. "I know." Batman offered instead, a phantom pain dancing across his back at the words. At Clark's surprised glance, he continued, "Lois Lane decided that Bruce Wayne's shirt was missing a glass of champagne tonight. She made quite the spectacle." Clark winced, face twisting. "Ah!" There was a long, heavy silence that followed, and Bruce wasn't really sure how to fill it. "Go home, Cal," he offered, ignoring the expression that flitted across Clark's face at his casual use of his Kryptonian name. "Home? But Lois is—" "Go home," he parroted, trying not to let his eyes roll in annoyance. "Go home, cry, and let your mother make you pie. She'll want to look after you, and you'll be of no use until you've dealt with this Lane situation," he said. "I'm sure the League will keep an eye on Metropolis." There was a pause where Clark's gaze went soft, clearly reading between the lines. "Thanks, B," he murmured before glancing out over at the Gotham skyline. "Be safe." "Goodbye, Cal." Batman returned, modulator not hiding the begrudging affection, much to his chagrin. Clark must have heard it too, because he grinned brightly before launching into the night sky, leaving Bruce alone once more. The following 2 weeks were less than fun. It started with a less than friendly piece on some of Wayne Enterprises' ventures into GM crops, citing several sources that were a little sketchy and giving a few too many words to the critics of GM Foods simply to help bolster the critique of the company and of Bruce. It escalated to an article highlighting the shady connections that WE had coveted in the past when they focused on military contracts to bring in the big money. It ended, at least for the moment, with a particularly scathing article about Bruce himself, which managed to tank not only his stock price for 4 days, but also a deal that had taken 5 months to structure and cost $1.6 billion. He'd been angry enough about the latter, because building wind farms, installing solar panels, and generating enough clean energy to power the eastern seaboard is pretty fucking important to exert his authority. After review, the planet was forced to print a retraction, and Lane was put on suspension for a week. Not that such a thing stopped her from writing, of course. And he, with a lot of Lucius's help, salvaged the deal. It was, however, made almost worth it when Clark returned, despite his apparent dislike of Bruce, watching his ex-girlfriend target his soulmate repeatedly in the media to the point of nearly ruining something designed to help save the Earth for just a little bit longer was apparently too far. The hissing rebukes that Clark had given Lois turned her an unflattering shade of chilly red and led to an imposed wall of silence that had, according to his inside source, and Clark, who now saw Bruce as his confidant, made working in the office almost unbearable. It had reached a point where Bruce was compiling contingency plans should Lois ever decide that the world needed to know just who donned the cape. While he wasn't one to brag, the sheer scale and thoroughness of Lois' smear campaign would not only disregard Clark as a suspect for being Superman until the end of time, but also quite possibly end Lane's career in journalism. Clark, however, filled with optimism, despite the anger oozing from his former flame, was certain that Lois wouldn't risk the Superman identity just to get back at him. "She's mad, but she believes in what I'm trying to do," he told Bruce one evening at Watchtower over a plate of dirty fries 5 days after returning from his self-imposed solitude. Bruce, for once, let Clark call the shots and did nothing about Lane at all. But while he had been preoccupied by the drama of the Kent-Lane non-relationship, he had missed the development in the Clark-Batman friendship. He wasn't sure how he missed it, particularly as he was the world's greatest detective, but he had. At first he tried to deny its existence, ignoring the telltale signs that, if he were honest, had been creeping in weeks before he and Lane finally parted ways. Then he just tried to pretend that it meant anything other than it did. In the end, it was difficult to keep swallowing down the truth. Clark liked Batman. It was quiet, the kind of like that lingered on the edges and turned people a delicate shade of pink. It was young and new enough that Clark himself wasn't quite sure what to do about it, but it was there. It was there in the lingering stares directed his way, in the hushed conversations that Superman seemed determined to draw Bruce into about little things or big things or even remarking on the weather. It was even in the way the alien pulled his bottom lip in with his teeth and worried it a little before offering a half-smile and returning his attention back to what it was supposed to be on, rather than watching the side of Bruce's head. The hours they had spent together previously now felt stolen and intimate, as though the world was hitting pause just so they could share their days. Well, Clark shared, and Bruce offered meaningless information or Batman-styled reports on the activities of Gotham's criminal underbelly, but the Man of Steel coveted the words as though they described Bruce's inner thoughts and dreams. It wasn't long before Diana noticed, and then it became impossible for Bruce to pretend it was all in his head. In the end, the situation found itself thrust into the limelight a little over a month after the Clark-Lane blowout. Hal had informed them a few days previously of another Green Lantern who had been more than a little abusive of his power and had subsequently banished him to an antimatter universe, and wasn't that the mother of all mindfucks? But he was back with a yellow ring and apparently very angry at Jordan. Not that Batman could imagine why. While Hal felt confident that he, with some help, could defeat Sinestro, he was worried about the Weaponers who could do serious damage to the people of Earth while he was busy fighting the former Lantern. And so the Justice League was called into action once more. The battle had been long, and even the metahumans were flagging, constantly clearing the path of civilians and battling what seemed like an endless parade of Weaponers. Bruce didn't remember too much of the actual battle, not least as strategy had long since gone and it was only instinct and adrenaline pushing him forward. He did remember being calf-deep in thick black mud that was trying desperately to drag him into the bowels of the earth. He remembered an aching, wheezing burn in his chest where the several broken ribs dug cruelly into any organ they could reach. He remembered his gloves being slick with the blood of the alien engineers or whatever Hal had told them they were. His belt was practically empty, most of his tech was fried, and his bones felt as though they'd been filled with molten lead. Every step felt like dragging a tractor behind him, and every thud from their swords or blow from their shields threatened to shatter his bones. Even Alfred had gone quiet in his ear, sensing that any distraction, no matter how small, could see him lay sprawled on the dirt, blood bubbling up through his torn lips and skin splitting open around a blade. In the end, it was something small, Hal giving a cry of victory as Sinestro went crashing to the ground, Yellow Ring hurtling off his finger, drew his attention just long enough for a weaponer to throw a particularly well-aimed strike at the back of his head, right where the cowl's protection waned. Instantly, his vision turned black and Bruce pitched forward, out before he hit the ground. He woke slowly, blinking into awareness the way he did after a particularly nasty hangover had taken his brain and played. Immediately, his hands went to his face, finding relief in the familiar feel of the cowl beneath his fingertips. A breath, and he was glancing over at Diana, dressed in civilian clothes and looking distinctly unimpressed.
We wanted to check you for internal injuries, but your suit is lined with lead, she began, and so we considered taking the suit off. Clark disagreed, told us you were entitled to your privacy, but eventually worried one out after you didn't wake.
A pause.
You booby-trapped your suit.
A long, heavy silence. Of course, he rasped, words like needles on his tongue. Diana scowled.
We don't know how badly you're injured, she said before softening. You took quite a blow, Batman.
Bruce sat slowly, glancing around and noting for the first time that he was in the Watchtower infirmary. Occupational hazard, he offered when realizing the Amazonian was still waiting for a response.
I know, but you are only human, Batman. You can't do this forever. This will destroy you, she said before her voice dropped, and she continued the words almost as an afterthought that, had Bruce been anyone else, he would have missed. Not to mention it would destroy Clark.
Rage. Blinding rage. He'd been desperate to avoid the thought, the horrible, ironic, cruel thought that his soulmate liked him, wanted to love him, and suddenly there was nowhere to hide. Diana's words, no doubt seemingly small to her, felt like a nuke through his chest. Excuse me, Bruce bit out, voice laced with more ice than both poles combined.
Diana blinked, eyes widening, before she softened. Oh, Batman, she began. Surely you know his affection for you. If you're not going to look out for yourself for you, then at least do it for Cal. He was so worried, you know. He tore through what was left of the weaponers when you went down like they were nothing.
Silence. War drums took up residence in his ears, and his mouth filled with the bitter, all-too-familiar taste of metal and salt. If he weren't in company and incandescent with rage, he'd no doubt be devolving into a panic attack. 4. Cow. He finally spat, lurching to his feet, proud that he didn't stagger, even with the radiating pain becoming more and more apparent. Diana felt wrong-footed, that much was clear, but rather than backpedal as most would have done, she doubled down, furrowing her brows and murmuring,
"It's not exactly fair on him, Batman."
"Fair?" Bruce shot back, barely keeping the rage in his voice in check. "I will not be held accountable nor check my actions because the Boy Scout has discovered puppy love," he snarled, storming from the room and down the corridor. "Call me when this returns to being a league, and not an attempt to see me and Superman sitting around a campfire talking about feelings." He tossed over his shoulder, shoving past Flash, who had come around the corner to investigate the commotion. "Diana?" Barry asked, nervous, following quickly in her wake as she hurried after Batman, her mouth forming words that Bruce had long since tuned out. "Batman!" Arthur shouted, rising when he saw the man stride into the meeting hall with an authority that not even broken ribs, concussion, internal bleeding, and whatever else he had could negate. "You all right?" "I'll live." He spat back, giving a reply only because Arthur was nice and didn't ask about Superman or talk about Bruce Wayne and honestly seemed more interested in beer than love. "B?" The voice was quiet and soft and hesitant, but layered with enough genuine concern and desperation that for a moment Bruce almost felt sorry for him. Then Diana's throwaway comment and Superman's dismissal all those months ago slammed into him, and the feeling vanished like smoke on the wind. But still his mouth couldn't shape words, so he did what he was best at, exiting stage left with as much flair and as much mystery as he could. They didn't follow him. Alfred was a visage of concern when Bruce finally climbed out of the Batmobile, letting every inch of his pain show on his face. "Master Wayne," he murmured, kind and understanding, taking Bruce's weight like it was nothing. "I've taken the liberty of making you some cocoa." Cocoa. He felt like he was a child again, sobbing in Alfred's shirt and screaming himself hoarse because his parents were gone, and he felt so alone in the world. "He likes me," Bruce offered, voice scratchy and numb. Alfred smiled gently, catching Bruce's gaze and pouring as much love and affection as he could into the look, knowing that Bruce needed it. Really needed it. "Of course he does, Master Bruce," he whispered like the words were a secret. "After all, there isn't anything to dislike."